Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into, well, a question that's captivated human thought for millennia. The existence of God.
It's a monumental topic. Absolutely.
It's huge, but we've got a really rich collection of perspectives here in our source material, arguments for and against God's existence. It covers philosophy, theology, even some scientific angles on this very fundamental question.
Indeed. And it's a subject that really forces us to look at the fabric of reality, our place in the cosmos, where meaning comes from.
Right.
So our aim in this deep dive really is to extract the core logic behind some of the most, prominent arguments on both sides.
Exactly. And just to be clear, our mission isn't to, champion belief or disbelief or claim we have the final proof.
Not at all.
We just want to give you, our listener, a structured, insightful overview of the main lines of reasoning. Okay, so let's unpack this, starting with the arguments for God's existence.
Sounds good. And the first big one is usually the cosmological argument, the first cause idea. The basic idea is pretty straightforward, actually. Everything that begins to exist has a cause.
Okay.
And given what we know about the universe, the Big Bang, about 13.8 billion years ago, the argument says the universe itself had a beginning.
So it must have had a cause.
Exactly. It forces you to think about causation itself and whether the rules inside the universe apply to its actual origin. That's a big philosophical debate right there.
So if the universe started, it needed a cause. And this cause, proponents argue, has to be, outside the universe, timeless, spaceless.
Immensely powerful, often identified as God.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is the support it gets. I mean, the scientific consensus on the universe having a finite age definitely helps the beginning part. Plus, there's the philosophical problem of infinite regress, like an endless chain of causes going back forever. Many find that logically tricky, suggesting there must be a first uncaused cause.
Okay, but that immediately raises the question, right, if everything needs a cause...
What caused God?
Exactly.
Yep, that's the critical counterpoint. And the usual theistic response is that God is different. God's seen as a necessary being, not contingent like the universe.
Contingent meaning.
Yeah.
Dependent on something else.
Right. Things that could not have existed. The idea is God is self-existent, just is, and so doesn't need a prior cause.
Okay. I see the distinction they're making. All right, moving on then. We hit the teleological argument. The argument from design. This one always makes me think of just, wow, look at the order in things.
Precisely. That's the core idea. The universe shows this incredible order, complexity, even a apparent purpose. Think about the fine-tuning of physics.
Yeah.
Or just the conditions needed for life itself. The argument suggests intelligent design is a more plausible explanation than just, random chance.
It really is mind-boggling when you think about the details. Earth's distance from the sun, the basic forces of nature. It all seems so precisely calibrated for life. It's like that watch analogy, isn't it? Paley's watchmaker.
Exactly that. Find a complex watch on the beach, you assume a watchmaker, not that the sand and waves just made it.
Right.
And the fine-tuning examples are powerful. The cosmological constant, for instance, it governs the universe's expansion. If that number was off by, a ridiculously tiny fraction.
Yes.
1 part in 10 to the 120th power.
Wow.
Life just wouldn't be possible. Proponents see that incredible unlikelihood as strong evidence for an intelligent agent.
But then you get the counter-arguments, like the multiverse idea. Maybe our universe is just one of zillions, and we just happen to be in a lucky one. Or natural selection, explaining complex life without a designer directing it.
Those are definitely the big counterpoints. The theistic response often questions, is there actual evidence for a multiverse? Is it really less speculative?
Fair enough.
And they'd say natural selection explains how life evolves, sure, but not why the fundamental laws of the universe were fine-tuned in the first place to allow life and evolution to even happen. They see those alternatives as maybe insufficient.
Okay, next up, the moral argument. This one feels, more personal. It's about right and wrong.
It does connect deeply, yes. It highlights how difficult it seems to ground objective morality, real right and wrong, if you only have a purely naturalistic worldview. It suggests maybe we need a transcendent standard.
So the core idea is objective moral values exist. Torturing babies for fun is just wrong universally.
Right. That's often the kind of example used. Things that seem objectively true, morally speaking. The argument then goes, The best explanation for these objective morals is a moral lawgiver, usually identified as God.
Because if morality is just subjective, just opinion or cultural agreement,
Then what real authority does it have? Why should I follow it if I don't want to or if my culture disagrees? A transcendent source, like God, the argument goes, gives morality a solid foundation, an objective standard. And you do see this interesting agreement across cultures on core principles. Don't murder, don't steal. It suggests something deeper. Plus, purely atheistic frameworks, like trying to explain morality just through evolution, sometimes struggle to explain why we feel such strong binding obligations beyond just survival.
but couldn't it just be social cooperation?
Yeah.
Empathy? We're social animals. Rules help us get along.
That's a very common and important counterpoint. Social cooperation, empathy. They definitely explain how moral behaviors likely developed.
Okay.
But the theistic pushback is often that this explains the evolution of morality, maybe, but not its objective oughtness, that intrinsic feeling that some things are fundamentally right or wrong, regardless of the social benefit. Where does that come from?
Okay, now we get into something a bit more abstract, maybe, the ontological argument. This one can feel like a bit of a mental workout.
It can, yeah, but the core idea is actually quite elegant in a way. It starts with defining God as the greatest conceivable being, just the absolute greatest thing you can imagine. Then it argues existing in reality is greater than just existing in the mind.
Okay, makes sense. Reality is better than imagination.
So for God to truly be the greatest conceivable being, God can't just be an idea in our heads. God must actually exist in reality.
So the very definition of this perfect being includes existence. Otherwise, you could imagine something greater, namely that same being, but actually existing.
Exactly. Philosophers like Anselm, Descartes, they really developed this. They saw it as almost a logical proof from the definition itself. There are modern versions too, like Alvin Plantinga's modal ontological argument using possible worlds.
But the big pushback, the one I always hear, is from Kant. He said existence isn't really a property like being powerful or knowing. You can't just tack exists onto a concept to make it real.
That's a classic and crucial critique. The theistic clarification often is that they're talking about necessary existence, not contingent existence like ours. For a being defined as maximally great, existence isn't just an add-on property. It's essential to its very nature. It must exist.
Okay, that's a subtle distinction. Necessary versus contingent.
Hmm.
All right, shifting gears a bit, let's talk about something maybe more grounded in personal accounts.
Yeah.
The argument from religious experience. Lots of people point to this.
Definitely. The core premise is simple. Countless people across all sorts of cultures and times report having personal experiences of God.
Visions, feelings, profound insights.
Exactly. And the argument suggests the best explanation for these widespread, often life-changing experiences is that God actually exists and interacts with people.
And the sheer number is hard to ignore. Billions, apparently, claim some kind of spiritual experience that deeply affected them. And you do hear common themes, right? Like love, transcendence, even across different faiths.
Right. That consistency is often highlighted. But of course, there are strong counterarguments. Neuroscience points to brain activity, like in the temporal lobes, that can induce similar feelings of awe or presence. And cultural bias is another big one. People interpret experiences through their existing belief systems.
So how do theists respond to the neuroscience or culture points?
They often argue that, well, in brain states or culture shape the experience, that doesn't automatically mean the experience isn't caused by something genuinely divine. God could work through our brains or within our cultural understanding. It doesn't necessarily negate the source.
Interesting. Okay, finally, for the pro-arguments, we had the argument from consciousness. This dives into the mystery of our own awareness.
Yes, the idea here is that human consciousness, our subjective inner life, what it feels like to be us, the qualia philosophers talk about, isn't fully explained by just physical stuff, by brain chemistry alone.
Right.
And the argument suggests God, as a conscious, intelligent mind, provides a better explanation for how consciousness arises in the first place.
The reasoning being, it's hard to see how subjective awareness just pops out of non-conscious matter without some kind of purposeful cause. It's that hard problem people talk about.
Exactly that. How do you get subjective experience from purely objective physical processes? It's a huge puzzle. Theistic frameworks often posit God as the ultimate mind, who then imparts consciousness to creation.
But what about neuroscience? It's advancing all the time. Could we just be missing the physical explanation for now?
That's certainly the hope or claim from a purely materialist perspective. Critics argue neuroscience might eventually figure it out.
Yeah.
But the theistic proponents often respond that, well, current theories show correlations. This brain part lights up when you feel that, but they don't really explain the fundamental nature of subjective experience itself. Why does it feel like anything at all? They see current materialist explanations as still quite speculative on that core question.
Okay, and before we switch sides, the source material adds a couple of notes here. One is the idea of a cumulative case for God.
Yes, that's important. Many theists don't rely on just one argument being a knockout punch. They argue that when you take the cosmological, teleological, moral, experiential arguments, etc., together, they build a strong converging case.
Makes sense. Like strands in a rope.
Exactly. It also notes the philosophical assumption that rational thought can actually address these big metaphysical questions. And importantly, it reminds us that God isn't defined identically across all theistic traditions.
Right. These arguments tend to lean towards a more classical monotheistic concept.
Generally, yes, though there can be variations.
Okay, that's a solid tour of the arguments for God. Now let's flip the coin and dig into the arguments against God's existence. First up in our sources is the argument from divine hiddenness. This one always strikes me as quite powerful.
It is thought-provoking. The core idea is, if a perfectly loving, all-powerful God exists, wouldn't that God make sure everyone who sincerely seeks them finds them, or at least finds sufficient evidence?
Yeah.
But the reality seems to be that many reasonable, open-minded people look for evidence and just don't find it convincing. They remain non-believers.
So the logic is, a loving God wants a relationship. An all-powerful God can make that happen by revealing themselves clearly. Since many sincere seekers don't find God,
then maybe God doesn't exist, or isn't perfectly loving, or isn't all-powerful in the way claimed. The hiddenness itself becomes evidence against that specific concept of God.
and you see this historically and today, right? Whole cultures with no exposure, or individuals who search and just feel silence.
Exactly. J.L. Schellenberg's work really digs into this. People who aren't hostile, who are genuinely looking but remain unconvinced due to a lack of what they perceive as compelling evidence.
What's the usual response to this? Free will?
Faith.
That's the standard counterargument. God stays somewhat hidden to protect our free will, so belief is a genuine choice, an act of faith, not coercion.
Okay.
But the critique of that response is often, well, does this hiddenness disproportionately affect the sincere seekers? If you never even get compelling evidence, how free is your choice not to believe? It seems to undermine the very free will it's supposed to protect for some people.
A tricky one. Okay, next. The big one. The problem of evil. Probably the most emotionally charged argument. Without a doubt, the premise is stark. How can an all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good God coexist with the sheer amount of intense, seemingly pointless suffering we see in the world?
Gratuitous suffering, natural disasters, horrible diseases, innocent children suffering.
Precisely. The argument is, if God could prevent unnecessary suffering, omnipotence, knows about it, omniscience, and wants to prevent it, omnibenevolence, why does it still happen on such a vast scale?
So the persistence of evil suggests God lacks one of those key attributes, or maybe just doesn't exist.
That's the logical thrust, and the evidence is tragically abundant. The 2004 tsunami, childhood leukemia, philosophers from Epicurus onwards have framed this as both a logical contradiction and an evidential problem. The sheer amount and types of evil seem hard to reconcile with the classical concept of God.
And the responses are called theodicies, right? Trying to justify God in the face of evil, like suffering builds character as the price of free will.
Exactly. Soul-building theodicies, free will defenses, these are common attempts to explain why God might permit evil.
But the critics push back hard on those.
They do. They question whether the explanations really account for the scale and randomness of so much suffering. Does a child dying of a painful disease really serve a greater good we can justify? Does human free will explain earthquakes or pandemics? Theodicies often struggle with the magnitude and distribution of evil.
Okay, moving to a more logical challenge.
Yeah.
The argument from incoherence. This questions if the concept of God even makes sense.
Right. The idea here is that the attributes traditionally assigned to God, like being all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good, maybe perfectly just and merciful simultaneously, might actually contradict each other logically.
So if the definition itself is flawed,
then such a being can't logically exist. The classic example is the omnipotence paradox. Can God create a stone so heavy God can't lift it?
right, either answer seems to limit God's power.
Exactly. Or the conflict between omniscience, knowing the future perfectly, and genuine human free will. If God knows exactly what I'll choose tomorrow, is my choice truly free?
Or perfect justice versus perfect mercy. How can both be absolute?
These are the kinds of tensions proponents of this argument point to. They argue combining these absolute attributes creates logical impossibilities.
And the defense usually involves refining the definitions, like omnipotence only applies to logically possible things.
That's a common approach. Or arguing that human minds just can't fully grasp divine attributes.
But the critique then is, are you watering down the concepts? If omnipotence doesn't mean literally anything, is it still omnipotence?
Precisely. Redefining attributes to escape paradoxes can be seen as weakening the traditional claims about God's nature.
Okay, next argument against. The argument from naturalism. This feels more science-oriented.
It is. The core idea is that natural explanations, physics, biology, cosmology, seem sufficient to explain the universe and life. We don't need to invoke a supernatural being like God anymore.
God becomes an unnecessary hypothesis.
Essentially, yes. Science has explained so much that used to be attributed to God: the weather, disease, the origin of species, the universe itself. Occam's razor suggests we stick with the simpler natural explanations.
So cosmology offers models like quantum fluctuations for the universe's origin, maybe without a first cause. And evolution explains life's complexity without a designer.
Right. These scientific frameworks provide powerful, naturalistic accounts for phenomena that were once deep mysteries, possibly pointing to God.
But theists push back, saying naturalism doesn't explain why the laws of physics are what they are, or how consciousness arose from matter. The why questions.
Absolutely. Those are key points theists raise. Naturalists often respond that these are just current gaps in scientific understanding, not necessarily places to insert God. Future science might explain them naturally. The absence of a current natural explanation doesn't automatically prove a supernatural one.
Fair point. Okay, then there's the argument from inconsistent revelations. This focuses on differing religions.
Yes, the premise is, if God exists and reveals truth to humans, shouldn't those revelations be basically consistent?
But they're often not. Major religions contradict each other on fundamental things.
Exactly. The nature of God, Trinity versus strict monotheism, the path to salvation, the afterlife, huge disagreements. The argument suggests this inconsistency points towards human origins for these religions rather than a single divine source.
It's hard to reconcile the idea of one God giving such conflicting messages.
It is. And looking at the history and cultural development of religions often shows patterns that seem very human, tied to politics, geography, social needs, rather than purely divine.
The response might be that only one religion is true, or God reveals different facets to different people.
Those are common theistic explanations, or that human error corrupted the original messages.
Yeah.
But critics question why an all-powerful, loving God would allow such persistent confusion and conflict over the supposed divine truth. Couldn't God communicate more clearly?
Okay, final argument against listed here. The argument from non-belief. Similar to hiddenness, but focused on the scale.
It is related, yeah. The core idea is, if a loving, omnipotent God desires everyone to believe, perhaps for salvation, then the sheer number of non-believers throughout history and today is problematic.
Why wouldn't an all-powerful God ensure everyone at least has the chance to believe based on sufficient information?
That's the question. Billions have lived and died without exposure to certain theistic concepts, or remain unconvinced even with exposure. How does that fit with a God who desires universal belief?
And we have data on this, right? Historical records, modern surveys showing large non-religious or atheist populations.
Yes, Pew Research and others track this. It shows non-belief isn't just a fringe phenomenon, it's widespread, even in information-rich societies.
And the counterarguments, again, often involve free will.
God won't force belief.
Right, or that God judges people based on the knowledge they do have.
But again, the critic asks, couldn't an omnipotent God find ways to provide convincing evidence or inspiration without overriding free will? Why allow such vast numbers to miss out if belief is truly important? It remains a significant challenge for that particular view of God's desires and power.
And just like with the arguments for God, the source notes these arguments against are often used cumulatively.
Yes, atheists or skeptics often see the combination problem of evil, hiddenness, incoherence, naturalism as building a strong case that theism is unlikely or unnecessary.
And these arguments tend to rely more on empirical evidence, logical consistency.
And often reflect a spectrum of views, from strong atheism, asserting God doesn't exist, to softer agnosticism or atheism, lacking belief due to insufficient evidence.
Wow. Okay, this has been, well, quite the journey through a huge intellectual landscape. We've touched on cosmology, morality, consciousness, logic, experience, arguments for and against.
It's definitely a lot to take in. These are incredibly deep issues, debated for centuries and still debated fiercely today.
Absolutely. And it's clear that this deep dive is really just scratching the surface, giving an overview of the core reasoning based on our source material.
Exactly. Each argument, each counter-argument, has layers upon layers of nuance and philosophical development behind it. This is really a starting point for further thought.
So as you, our listener, mull over all this, maybe think about this. Which arguments really resonated with you, either for or against, and why? What assumptions might be underneath that resonance for you? How do these different ways of thinking shape how we see existence itself, or belief, or mystery? And maybe most importantly, what new questions has this sparked for your own journey of understanding?